On her birthday, an elderly woman ended up in a nursing home when her adopted son decided to get rid of her. But a week later, she won $24 million and changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching us from. The morning sun crept slowly through the thin curtains of Grace Williams' living room, spilling muted light across the worn wooden floors. It touched the framed photographs lined carefully on the mantel, captured smiles frozen in time, reminders of laughter that once filled these rooms. The house itself was modest, a small single-story home with faded paint and a porch that sagged slightly under its own weight. Yet, for Grace, it was not just a house. It was a living archive of decades spent nurturing, loving, and hoping. Today was her 73rd birthday. She moved through the kitchen with careful steps, her hands steady but slower than they had been years ago. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and warm butter as she prepared Tyler's favorite, sweet potato pie, just the way he liked it when he was a boy. She didn't have much of an appetite herself anymore, but traditions mattered. She set the pie on the counter to cool, smoothing her apron down absently, stealing glances toward the clock every few minutes. Tyler had promised he would come today. She thought of how once he had clutched her hand so tightly when he was small, terrified of the dark, whispering, "I'll always take care of you, Mama." The memory ached inside her chest, a quiet echo of a different time. The ticking clock grew louder in the kitchen as the hours stretched. Grace pulled a weathered photo album from the shelf and sat at the small table, flipping through a page after page. Tyler's first day of school, his high school graduation, his first apartment, the milestones of a life she had sacrificed everything to support. There were pictures of birthday parties long ago, handmade cards with shaky handwriting that said, "Best Mom Ever," in crayon. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hurts behind the eyes. When the doorbell finally rang, she straightened up, heart racing like a young girl's. She smoothed her dress, brushed a stray gray hair from her forehead, and opened the door. Tyler stood there, tall and clean-cut, in a pressed suit that smelled faintly of cologne. His phone was in his hand. He didn't even look up when she opened the door. No, "Happy birthday," no, "You look nice, Mama," just a quick, distracted nod. Behind him, the trunk of his sleek black car stood open. "Come on, we're running late," he said, glancing briefly at her before returning his gaze to the glowing screen. Confused, Grace stepped onto the porch, clutching her cardigan tighter around her small frame. She looked past him, seeing no wrapped gifts, no balloons, no signs of celebration. Only a waiting car and a son who barely seemed to notice the woman who had raised him. She hesitated, her heart thudding painfully, but Tyler didn't. He turned, already striding back to the car. With trembling hands, she picked up the small suitcase he had packed for her, just one, and followed him. The ride was quiet, save for the occasional buzz of Tyler's phone as he responded to work emails. Grace sat silently, the pie she had baked cooling uselessly on the counter back home, forgotten. She watched the city roll by, the streets she knew so well blurring into the unfamiliar as Tyler drove her farther away from everything she had built, everything she had loved. "Where are we going?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll see," he said, without looking up from the GPS on the dashboard. The sign came into view before he spoke again. Rose Pines Senior Living. It read in neat, sterile letters above manicured hedges. The building behind it was large and beige, the kind of place that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and something heavier underneath. Loneliness, maybe. Tyler pulled up to the curb, shifted the car into park, and popped the trunk. He didn't get out. Instead, he tapped away at his phone, barely glancing at her. "They're expecting you," he said. Grace sat frozen for a moment. "Expecting me?" she repeated, but he was already engrossed in whatever work matter demanded his attention. There was no hug, no words of reassurance, no, "I'll be by tomorrow to check on you," or "This is just temporary." Nothing but the mechanical motion of her son handing a manila folder to a nurse who appeared at the entrance. "She's a fall risk," he said briskly, then turned back to the car. Grace stood there on the curb, holding her suitcase in one hand, a folder containing her entire medical history in the other. She felt as though she had become invisible in front of her own son, a shadow of a memory he no longer needed. She watched him drive away without a backward glance. The nurse, a tired-looking woman with a tight bun and a badge that said Darla, motioned for Grace to follow. "Room 214, she said without making eye contact, already moving inside. Grace's steps were heavy as she crossed the threshold into Rose Pines. The walls were painted a pale, forgiving beige. Faux plants sat stiffly in the corners. The scent of institutional cleanliness hung thick in the air. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Room 214 was small. A twin bed with starched white sheets sat against the wall, a single dresser by the window. A plastic chair occupied the corner, its legs uneven on the linoleum floor. Grace placed her suitcase carefully by the bed and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. She stared at the room for a long time, absorbing the reality of it. Her life, condensed into one small room in a building designed to forget the vibrant lives that now merely existed within its walls. Her birthday passed in silence. No cake, no candles, no laughter. Just the soft clicking of a clock on the wall and the low murmur of televisions from other rooms. Later that night, lying stiffly on the too-firm mattress, Grace turned her face toward the window. Beyond it, the sky stretched dark and endless, the stars indifferent to the small tragedies unfolding below. She remembered the birthdays she had spent baking cakes for Tyler, wrapping little gifts she had saved up for months to buy, decorating the house with homemade banners because she couldn't afford store-bought ones. She remembered the way his face used to light up at the sight of her, how he used to call her Mama in that sweet, unguarded voice. When had that voice become so cold? The tears came quietly, sliding down her cheeks without sobs, without sound. She didn't bother to wipe them away. No one was looking. The emptiness of the room seeped into her bones, and she realized that it wasn't just her birthday that had been forgotten. It was her. Somewhere, deep inside her, a small, stubborn ember flared, a tiny defiance against the erosion of her existence. She closed her eyes and let the dark take her, not in defeat, but in quiet, aching sorrow. And as the sterile hum of Rose Pines lulled the building into uneasy sleep, Grace Williams lay awake, feeling the ground shift beneath her life. Tomorrow, she told herself, tomorrow will come, whether anyone notices or not. Tomorrow she would have to find a way to endure. Or perhaps, just perhaps, find a way to begin again. The morning came pale and cold through the narrow window of room 214. Grace opened her eyes to the dull grayness, a heavy silence weighing on her chest. She lay still for a long time, listening to the sounds of Rose Pines waking up, the faint clatter of carts rolling down hallways, the murmur of a television playing an old sitcom somewhere in the distance, the occasional cough from behind thin walls. Everything here moved with a sluggishness that seemed designed to make the days bleed into each other, to dull the senses until even time forgot to count. Grace pushed herself upright, her joints stiff and aching in ways she had never noticed before. Her suitcase remained untouched at the foot of the bed. She had unpacked nothing. Somehow, admitting this place was hers felt like surrender, and she was not yet ready to lay down arms, even if the battle seemed unwinnable. Breakfast was served in a communal dining room with tables arranged neatly in rows. The other residents sat slumped in their chairs, spoons moving mechanically to mouths, eyes glazed over with the same weariness that had settled deep in Grace's own bones. She took her tray, picked at the lukewarm oatmeal, and wondered how many of them had been deposited here in much the same way she had. Unwanted gifts someone else could no longer find room for. The staff was efficient but distant, trained smiles stretched thin over tired faces. They referred to the residents in tones of brisk affection, calling them dear and sweetheart, but never stopping long enough to truly see them. Grace caught glimpses of other lives at the edges of her vision, frail hands clinging to walkers, whisper-thin voices mumbling half-remembered songs, photographs of smiling families displayed proudly on bedside tables, their subjects absent and growing more distant with each passing year. She spent her days wandering the corridors, tracing her fingers along the wallpaper seams, memorizing the cracks in the linoleum floor. The world outside Rose Pines seemed impossibly far away. Her little house with its sagging porch, her garden with the wild roses she had planted herself, the kitchen that always smelled of spices and warm bread. All of it receded like a half-remembered dream. Grace attended the scheduled activities because there was nothing else to do. Bingo on Mondays, crafts on Wednesdays, movie nights on Fridays. She sat in the back, crocheting small squares of nothingness, her hands moving out of habit rather than desire. The movies were always old, comedies from decades ago, and the laughter they tried to coax from the audience was thin and brittle. Sometimes she sat by the window in the common room, watching the parking lot. Visitors came and went, smiling children bringing balloons, weary middle-aged men carrying take-out bags. She watched them all, feeling invisible, a ghost tethered to a chair. Tyler had not visited. He had not called. She told herself he was busy, that maybe he would come on Sunday, or the Sunday after that, but deep down she knew better. The emptiness became a companion, a silent presence that shadowed her steps. She began to wonder if she had somehow shrunk, becoming smaller and smaller until even the people she loved most could no longer see her. Late at night, when the building had fallen into an uneasy stillness, Grace lay awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. They formed strange patterns in the dim light, roads leading nowhere, rivers drying up before they could reach the sea. She traced them with her eyes until they blurred and the memories came. She remembered Tyler's tiny hand clutching hers, the way he used to fall asleep against her chest, trusting her to keep the monsters at bay. She remembered working double shifts, cleaning houses long after her back began to ache, just so she could buy him new shoes for school. She remembered cheering from the bleachers at his high school graduation, clapping so hard her palms stung. And she remembered the first time he had looked embarrassed by her. It had been a parent-teacher night at his private school, a scholarship she had scraped and fought to win for him. She had worn her best dress, polished her shoes, and smiled proudly as she walked beside him. But in the crowded hallway, surrounded by the polished, affluent parents of his classmates, she had felt him stiffen at her side. When one of his teachers had assumed she was a housekeeper, he hadn't corrected them. Grace had laughed it off, telling herself he was just shy, just trying to fit in. But the memory stayed, hidden like a splinter under her skin, aching quietly when she thought too hard about it. It was easier to blame herself. She had made mistakes. Maybe she had been too protective, too old-fashioned. Maybe she hadn't prepared him for the world he now lived in, a world where she was a relic, something inconvenient to be hidden away. She thought about their last real conversation, before the day at Rose Pines. It had been on the phone, rushed between his meetings. She had mentioned a small leak under the kitchen sink, and he had sighed loudly, the way people sigh when they are already regretting the time they are spending on you. "Maybe it's time to start thinking about downsizing, Mama," he had said, his voice clipped and businesslike. "A condo near my office, no stairs, less maintenance." She had laughed, thinking he was joking, but he hadn't laughed back, and that had been the beginning of the end, though she hadn't seen it clearly then. Sitting alone in the room 214, Grace realized that she had been making excuses for Tyler for years, excusing every missed call, every forgotten holiday, every distracted, half-hearted hug. She had told herself he was busy, important, building a life. She had refused to see what was right in front of her, that she was no longer a part of that life. She was a relic of a past he didn't want to carry into his shining future. The realization was not a thunderclap. It was a slow, creeping tide that eroded her foundations until, finally, she was standing ankle-deep in the cold truth. She had been left behind, not out of cruelty, perhaps, but out of convenience. One afternoon, as she sat by the window tracing the patterns of raindrops against the glass, she watched a young woman wheel her elderly mother into a waiting car. They both laughed at something, the sound warm and real, cutting through the sterile air like sunlight. The daughter wrapped a blanket around her mother's shoulders with tender hands, and the mother leaned into her, resting her head briefly against her daughter's arm. Grace felt something inside her splinter, not from envy, but from the sudden, aching awareness of what she had lost, or perhaps what she had never truly had. She pressed her palm flat against the window pane, feeling the cold seep into her skin. Somewhere out there, life continued, messy, complicated, beautiful. Somewhere out there, people still chose each other, still fought for each other, still loved without condition, but not here, not for her. And in that hollow space where grief once threatened to swallow her whole, something else began to stir. Something older, deeper, forged from a lifetime of surviving what should have broken her. Grace Williams had been invisible before. She had been overlooked, underestimated, and forgotten more times than she could count. But she had never surrendered, not truly, not completely. She would not surrender now. The thought was small, fragile as a flame in a storm, but it was there. She would endure. She would endure not because someone else deemed her worthy, but because she was worthy. She rose from the window seat and returned to her room, moving slowly but with a steadiness she had not felt since she arrived at Rose Pines. She opened her suitcase for the first time and began to unpack. Not because she accepted this place, but because somehow she knew it would not be her ending. Not yet. Not ever. The days slid past in slow procession, one after another, blending together like brushstrokes on a canvas left too long in the rain. Grace moved through them like a figure under water, her motion slowed by the heavy drag of the place. There were rhythms to life at Rose Pines, but no melodies, no crescendos. Only the same soft shuffle of slippers on linoleum, the muted clatter of meal trays, the low drone of televisions playing shows from another era. Grace had become, in many ways, a part of the furniture. The staff, while polite, had ceased to see her in any real sense. She was another chart to update, another bed to make, another pill to administer at the right time. Even the other residents, trapped in their own shrinking worlds, barely nodded as they passed. It would have been easy to believe that she had ceased to exist in any meaningful way. She still sat by the window sometimes, staring out at the parking lot where no familiar cars ever pulled in. The seasons had begun to shift. The trees at the edge of the lot had started to shed their leaves, the colors muted and tired like everything else here. She watched as nurses ushered visiting family members inside, children bouncing at their sides, arms full of flowers or grocery bags or holiday decorations. Grace observed it all with a quiet detachment, as though peering through glass at a life she no longer inhabited. It was on one such afternoon, the sky bruised and heavy with the threat of rain, that a nurse named Ellie approached her with something in her hand. Ellie was one of the younger aides, with tired eyes and a ponytail that always seemed to be slipping free. She wasn't unkind, but she moved briskly, always 3 steps ahead of herself, as if she were afraid that if she stopped moving, she might simply collapse. "This came for you," Ellie said, holding out a small envelope. She didn't make eye contact, didn't wait for thanks, just placed the envelope on the table beside Grace and hurried off. Grace stared at it for a long moment. Mail was rare here, and when it did come, it was usually bills or impersonal newsletters from the administration. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling slightly, not from age, but from the strange, sudden jolt of feeling something unexpected touch her life again. The envelope was unremarkable. No return address. Her name, Grace Williams, scrawled in hurried, almost childish handwriting. She turned it over once, twice, then carefully slid a finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a simple folded piece of paper. No letter, no note. And tucked into the crease of the paper was a brightly colored scratch-off lottery ticket. Grace blinked at it, her mind slow to catch up. A lottery ticket. She hadn't bought one in years. Once, long ago, she would occasionally pick one up at the grocery store, usually around the holidays, joking with the cashier about how she'd buy a beach house if she ever won. She never did, of course, and as life grew heavier, those little indulgences had fallen away. She tried to remember. She had been at the grocery store several months ago, not long before Tyler had brought her here. There had been a young girl working the register, flustered, her hands shaking as she tried to correct a mistake on the cash register. Grace had smiled kindly, handed her a few extra dollars, and told her not to worry about the difference. The girl had slipped a lottery ticket into her shopping bag with a conspiratorial wink, saying, "For good luck." Grace had forgotten all about it until now. She turned the ticket over in her hand. Bright colors, cartoon coins and dollar signs, the promise of something absurd and impossible. She almost laughed at herself for even considering it. What good would it do? What difference could a scrap of cardboard make in a place like this? Still, something in her, something stubborn and quietly yearning, reached for the drawer of the side table where she kept a few personal things. Inside was an old quarter, tarnished and worn smooth at the edges. Tyler had given it to her when he was little, insisting it was lucky. She remembered the way he had pressed it into her palm with all the solemnity a 7-year-old could muster. She held the quarter now, feeling its familiar weight, and positioned the edge against the ticket. One slow scrape, then another. Numbers revealed themselves beneath the silver coating. 12, 34, 12 again, 34 again. She frowned, reading the small print on the back of the ticket. Match 2 numbers and 2 symbols and win the grand prize. She looked again. 34, and the same matching symbols beside them, a star and a crown. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. No, that couldn't be right. Her eyes scanned the ticket again, more slowly this time, tracing each number, each symbol. Winner, $24 million. The world tilted slightly. Grace sat back, the ticket slipping from her fingers and fluttering onto the blanket covering her lap. She stared at it as though it might suddenly vanish, as though it might reveal itself to be a cruel joke. But it didn't. It stayed there, stubborn and bright, a promise scrawled in childish colors across cheap cardstock. $24 million. A laugh escaped her, sharp and startling in the quiet of the room. She clapped a hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. It wasn't the giddy, triumphant laugh of someone who had just become rich. It was the laugh of someone who had been drowning in silence and had just realized she could still make a sound. The nurse passing by the doorway glanced in, her brow furrowed, but Grace waved her off with a shaky hand. She sat there for a long time, the ticket resting lightly against her palm, as the reality of it settled around her like a cloak. She could leave. She could really leave. She didn't have to sit by the window anymore, waiting for a car that would never come. She didn't have to eat lukewarm oatmeal under the buzzing fluorescent lights. She didn't have to shrink herself smaller and smaller until she disappeared altogether. She could be Grace Williams again, not Tyler's obligation, not resident 214. She could choose herself. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating. The next morning, after a night spent staring wide-eyed at the ceiling, Grace made her first phone call in months. She used the facility's landline, requesting privacy under the pretense of handling a small financial matter. No one questioned her. The lawyer who answered sounded skeptical at first. Who wouldn't be? An elderly woman in a nursing home claiming to have a winning lottery ticket was, at best, a curiosity, and, at worst, a scam. But Grace had lived a life learning how to make people see her even when they preferred not to. She spoke calmly, clearly, offering the necessary verification, arranging for secure verification. Within a week, it was done. Quietly, professionally, without fanfare. Grace watched from the common room window as a plain black sedan pulled into the parking lot, its driver stepping out in a dark suit, carrying a briefcase. She met him in the administrator's office, signing documents with a steady hand, her heart hammering against her ribs all the while. When it was over, she returned to her room, the official letter tucked safely inside her Bible, and sat quietly, her mind racing faster than it had in years. She didn't tell anyone at Rose Pines. She didn't call Tyler. She didn't need to. This was hers. This was for her. She began to plan, in secret and in silence, the same way she had learned to survive all her life. Not rashly, not with the recklessness of someone who thought they had nothing to lose, but with the quiet, patient precision of a woman who knew that freedom, once within reach, must be claimed carefully, deliberately. She made lists. She imagined places she might live. A small house near the ocean, perhaps, or a quiet town where no one knew her history. She thought about starting something new, something bigger than herself, something that could turn the aching loss she had carried into something that mattered. She did not dream of mansions or luxury cars or the glittering, empty promises of wealth. She dreamed of space, of peace, of days that belonged to her and her alone. For the first time in what felt like forever, Grace Williams smiled. Not the brittle smile she wore for the nurses, not the hollow smile she wore for the other residents, but a real smile, a beginning. Outside the window, the rain had begun to fall, soft and steady. It drummed against the glass like a heartbeat, like a promise. Change was coming, and this time it would be hers to command. The days following the confirmation of her fortune unfolded with a strange, heavy stillness, as if the walls of Rose Pines themselves sensed the shifting tides moving invisibly through Grace's life. On the surface, nothing changed. She still rose early with the dull clanging of the morning bell, still took her meals in the bland communal dining hall, still walked the gray corridors past faces that had long ago stopped seeing her. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. A quiet, blooming certainty took root within her, delicate and powerful, expanding each day like a flower growing through a crack in concrete. She kept her plans to herself. She spoke little, smiled politely when necessary, and pretended to participate in activities she no longer had any investment in. The other residents, absorbed in their own silent struggles, paid her no mind. Even the staff, efficient and distracted, continued to treat her as another scheduled task rather than a person poised on the precipice of transformation. That was how she wanted it. Silence was her ally. Invisibility was her armor. Each night, when the halls of Rose Pines hushed into uneasy slumber, Grace sat by the small desk tucked into the corner of her room, scribbling careful notes into a plain spiral notebook she had purchased from the facility's tiny gift shop. She wrote down everything she could think of, what steps she needed to take, whom she needed to contact, what arrangements had to be made. She mapped out her escape methodically, like planning a great migration from one life to another. The first step had been securing control over her winnings without attracting attention. With the help of the lawyer she had contacted, she opened new financial accounts under careful advisement. She made sure there were no public records linking her name to the lottery ticket. She instructed her attorney to create layers of protection around her assets, establishing trusts and accounts under discrete titles. She even arranged for a confidential mailing address, a P.O. box registered through a third-party service that could forward her important documents without ever revealing her physical location. Grace had spent her entire life stretching every dollar, pinching every penny, making sacrifices for a future that had always seemed to benefit everyone but herself. Now, she wielded her wealth with deliberate, cautious hands, not seeking extravagance but building the foundations of a life where she could finally breathe freely. She spent long hours daydreaming about where she would go. The image that returned to her most often was of the sea, endless, open, eternal. Somewhere along the coast, she thought, where the air was filled with salt and the days moved to the slow rhythm of the tides. A small house, modest but bright, with wide windows that let in the morning light. A place where no one knew her name, where she would not be reduced to a file folder marked patient, or an obligation easily forgotten. She began searching for such a place in the quiet hours, using the public computer in the activity room under the pretense of emailing distant relatives. No one questioned her. After all, what danger could a 73-year-old woman pose? It was on a rainy Wednesday morning, as she scrolled through real estate listings with trembling hands, that she found it. A small white cottage near a sleepy coastal town 3 states away. The house sat atop a gentle rise, overlooking a bay where fishing boats bobbed like forgotten toys. It had a small garden, a wraparound porch, and wide windows that promised sunlit afternoons and long, quiet evenings. It was perfect. Grace moved quickly after that, she instructed her lawyer to purchase the property through a shell company, ensuring her privacy. She arranged for basic furnishings to be delivered and set up before her arrival. She even contacted a local nonprofit she had read about, one dedicated to providing services for seniors who had been neglected by their families. She made her first anonymous donation, enough to fund the organization's operations for a year. But the crown jewel of her planning was the foundation she established, the Voices Forgotten Trust. It would provide grants to nursing homes to improve quality of life for residents, sponsor legal aid for elderly individuals fighting for autonomy, and fund scholarships for young people committed to social work and elder care. Her legacy, she decided, would not be a name etched in marble or a mansion filled with silent halls. It would be a ripple moving outward into the world, quiet but unstoppable. All the while, Grace continued her performance at Rose Pines. She attended bingo night, nodding along as others clutched their cards and whispered numbers. She accepted her daily medications with a smile. She made polite conversation about the weather and the food, as if she intended to spend the rest of her days there, fading quietly into irrelevance. But inside, she was already gone. The morning of her departure arrived cool and bright, the sky a soft, tender blue that spoke of spring's arrival. Grace woke before the dawn, heart pounding but hands steady. She dressed carefully in her best outfit, a simple navy dress and a lightweight cardigan. She brushed her hair with more care than she had in weeks and applied a touch of lipstick, not for anyone else, but for herself. A discreet black car pulled up to the back entrance of Rose Pines, arranged by her attorney to avoid unnecessary attention. Grace had packed only what mattered: her notebook of plans, a few precious photographs, the tarnished quarter Tyler had once given her, and the winning lottery ticket, carefully folded and tucked into her Bible. She signed her discharge papers with a calm hand. The staff, surprised but too busy to ask many questions, waved her off with distracted goodbyes. No one asked why she was leaving. No one asked where she was going. The car door closed softly behind her, and just like that, Grace Williams ceased to exist at Rose Pines. The journey to her new life unfolded like a dream. She sat in the back seat, watching the scenery change outside the window. The endless concrete giving way to open fields, then to forests that seemed to breathe and sway with a life of their own. She watched towns pass by, each smaller than the last, until the land flattened into low, rolling hills that smelled of salt and earth. When they finally pulled into the gravel driveway of her new home, Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. The cottage was even lovelier in person, its white paint gleaming in the sunlight, the garden wild and exuberant with early blooms. The porch swing creaked gently in the breeze, a sound so sweet and familiar it made her chest ache. She stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath her sensible shoes, and walked slowly toward the front door. The key turned easily in the lock. She stepped inside. The air smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. The furnishings were simple but comfortable: a soft couch, a sturdy table, a bed dressed in clean linens. She wandered from room to room, touching surfaces as if to reassure herself that this was real, that she was real. In the kitchen, a window over the sink framed a view of the bay, its waters glinting in the afternoon sun. Grace leaned against the counter and watched the waves roll in and out, a steady, endless dance that had been happening long before her and would continue long after. The thought comforted her. She made herself a cup of tea, moving slowly, savoring the feel of doing something entirely for herself. No schedules, no bells, no forms to fill out or pills to take under supervision, just a woman in her home, on her own terms. As she sipped her tea, she thought about Tyler. She wondered if he had noticed her absence yet, or if her silence would eventually reach him like a ripple across a still pond. She wondered if he would care. And then she let the thought go, as easily as exhaling a breath she had been holding too long. This life was not about him. It was about her. She spent the next days settling in, planting herbs in the small garden, joining the library in town, walking along the beach with the sand cold and soft between her toes. She met neighbors who didn't know her history and didn't ask probing questions. They knew her simply as Miss Grace, the quiet woman with the kind smile and the steady gaze. In the evenings, she wrote letters to the board of her foundation, offering suggestions for grants and projects. She read books by the fire, played old records that made the walls hum with forgotten music, cooked meals that filled the house with the smells of garlic and rosemary and warm bread. Slowly, she stitched a new life together, piece by piece, each day a small act of reclamation. Sometimes, when the breeze came in just right, she thought she could hear the ocean whispering to her through the open windows. "You made it. You're free." And Grace, sitting on her porch swing with the fading sun painting the sky in bruised pinks and golds, would smile and whisper back, "I know." The days in Grace's new home unfurled in gentle succession, each morning beginning with the scent of salt air drifting through the open windows and each evening closing with the sigh of the sea against the shore. It was a rhythm she had never known before, one unmeasured by duty or expectation, one belonging solely to herself. She planted rosemary and lavender along the fence, learned the names of the seabirds that came to rest on her porch rail, and volunteered quietly at the local library, helping children find their first stories. Her life, once a collection of obligations, was now a series of small, profound freedoms. She did not think often of Tyler. Not because she hated him. Hate was a burden she had chosen not to carry, but because he no longer occupied the central space in her heart that he once had. He was a closed chapter, a photograph stored carefully in the drawer of her memory, faded but not torn. Far away from her, in the city where the glass buildings stretched into the sky and time moved differently, Tyler finally noticed her absence. It began with a phone call, casual at first, made from the leather passenger seat of a sleek town car, taking him between meetings. A sense of obligation, more than concern, had spurred him. He called Rose Pines to check in, fully expecting to be reassured that everything was as it should be, that Grace was still tucked safely away where he had placed her, handled and forgotten. But the voice on the other end of the line sounded uncertain, almost apologetic. "She's not here," the administrator said after a pause filled with the shuffling of papers. "She was discharged several weeks ago." Tyler blinked, the city flashing past the windows unnoticed. "What do you mean, discharged?" "Discharged to where?" The administrator hesitated. "We're not at liberty to share those details without her consent." For the first time in a very long while, Tyler felt a flicker of something that might have been panic. He ended the call quickly, promising to follow up, and stared down at his phone as if it might offer some further clarification. He tried her cell phone next, though he knew even as he pressed the call button that it would be futile. Grace had rarely used the device, preferring the landline back home, and since her move to Rose Pines, she had only answered a handful of times, her voice growing smaller with each conversation. The call went straight to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Over the next few days, a quiet unease settled into his bones, an unwelcome guest he couldn't shake. He told himself he was overreacting. Grace was old, yes, and forgetful at times, but she wasn't helpless. Maybe she had simply decided she didn't like Rose Pines and had moved into a cheaper facility. Maybe she was staying with one of her old church friends. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Still, he couldn't resist the gnawing impulse to know. He called the old neighbors from Grace's street, pretending to check in casually, fishing for information. Most of them hadn't seen her since the day he had taken her away. Her house had remained dark and empty. Mail piled up on the porch. The garden, once so carefully tended, had been overtaken by weeds. He sent emails to financial institutions where she might have held accounts. When those yielded no results, he contacted the local hospital to check for admissions, and even considered filing a missing persons report, though the thought made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't name. It wasn't until a week later that he stumbled across the article. A colleague at his firm forwarded it to him with a casual comment. "Can you believe some anonymous donor gave $20 million to charity? Must be nice to have that kind of cash to throw around." Tyler clicked the link out of idle curiosity and his heart lurched. The article was brief, a human interest piece buried on a regional news site. It spoke of a series of generous, anonymous donations made to various nonprofits, a literacy foundation, an elder care advocacy group, a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. The donations were coordinated, carefully structured, and had come from a trust registered only months earlier. There was no name, no photograph, but Tyler recognized Grace in the shape of the story as surely as if she had signed it herself. The timeline matched too perfectly. The quiet disappearance, the sudden, unexplained flow of money, and more than that, there was the nature of the donations themselves, the causes, the quiet humility, the desire not for attention but for impact. It was her. It had to be. Tyler sat back in his chair, his mind racing. How had she come into that kind of money? She had never had savings beyond a modest pension and Social Security. She had struggled her whole life. The idea that she had simply stumbled into a fortune and had not told him was inconceivable. He picked up his phone, his fingers trembling with a mixture of disbelief and something uglier, something colder. He called her lawyer first, the one who had handled her affairs before he had moved her into Rose Pines. A brusque receptionist informed him that their office no longer represented Grace Williams. He called Rose Pines again, pressing for information, threatening legal action. They remained steadfast in their refusal to share anything further. He even drove out to her old house, finding the windows boarded up, a foreclosure notice fluttering on the doorframe. Grace had disappeared, vanished as completely as if she had never existed. And for the first time in his adult life, Tyler realized that he was not the center of her world. The realization stung in ways he hadn't anticipated. He told himself it was the money, that she had been duped, that someone had manipulated her, that he needed to find her for her own protection. But late at night, when the city quieted and there was no one left to impress, he faced the deeper truth that Grace had left him. Deliberately, quietly, entirely. She had chosen a life without him. He began sending emails to the contact address listed for the Voices Forgotten Trust, framing them as inquiries from a concerned relative. He made phone calls to charity boards, posed as an interested donor, trying to trace the flow of money back to its source. He hired a private investigator, a man with a gray mustache and a sharp glint in his eye, to comb through property records, bank statements, anything that might offer a clue. The investigator reported back after 2 weeks. There was no clear trail. Whoever had orchestrated Grace's disappearance had done so with meticulous care. Shell companies, private trusts, confidential transactions, no forwarding addresses, no obvious ties. She had built a fortress of silence around herself, and Tyler was left standing outside its gates. He drove home that night along streets blurred by rain and city lights, feeling smaller than he could ever remember feeling. His mind replayed scenes from years ago, Grace waiting on the porch for him to visit, her face lighting up when he finally made time. The way she had pressed home-cooked meals into his hands even when he said he wasn't hungry. The quiet way she had accepted every slight, every delay, every broken promise. He had thought she would always be there, a constant in his life as fixed as the skyline. He had been wrong. The next morning, he composed an email addressed simply, Mom. It was short, clumsy, desperate in its simplicity. He apologized, though the words felt inadequate even as he typed them. He begged her to respond, to let him explain, to allow him the chance to make things right. The email bounced back. Address not found. Tyler stared at the screen, numb. Somewhere out there, Grace had built a life where he could not reach her, a life she had chosen without hesitation. He had underestimated her. He had mistaken her love for weakness. He had confused her silence for surrender. And now, standing in the ruins of the bridge, he had burned one careless word, one missed call at a time. He understood the price of that mistake. Grace Williams was gone, not lost, not broken, gone. And for the first time in his life, Tyler understood what it meant to truly be alone. The spring afternoon was gentle, almost too gentle, as if the world itself had decided to soften its edges for a while. The air along the coast carried the scent of the sea, a whisper of salt and wildness that wove through the open windows of Grace's small white cottage. She was sitting at the kitchen table, folding laundry, the mundane rhythm of the task soothing her mind. Outside, the garden she had planted herself was beginning to bloom. Tiny green shoots pushed through the dark earth, stubborn and bright, reaching toward a sky that promised warmer days ahead. Grace moved slowly, folding a cotton sweater with the kind of careful attention she had once reserved for bandaging a scraped knee or icing a birthday cake. There was peace in these small rituals, in the quiet assertion of control over the pieces of her life. Each shirt, each towel, a small affirmation. I am here. I am whole. She was humming under her breath a song from decades ago when she heard the knock at the door. It was not loud, not urgent, just a soft, hesitant tapping, almost as if the person on the other side was unsure they had the right place. Grace froze for a moment, the sweater still in her hands. She knew. Somehow, deep in the marrow of her bones, she knew. She set the sweater down carefully on the table, wiped her hands on her jeans, and walked to the door. When she opened it, Tyler was standing there, looking smaller than she remembered, the afternoon light drawing hard lines across his face. He held a crumpled paper bag in one hand, the logo of a bakery from town barely visible beneath his tight grip. His other hand was buried deep in his pocket, his shoulders tense as if bracing himself for something he couldn't quite name. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Grace stood silently, taking him in. He looked tired, not the tiredness of missed sleep or overwork, but a deeper weariness, the kind that seeps into a person when the weight of their choices finally settles. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice rough. Grace didn't reply immediately. She studied him, not with anger or bitterness, but with a clarity that came from long months of silence and distance. She saw him fully now, without the haze of old hopes or the soft focus of maternal forgiveness. She saw the man he had become, and the boy he had once been, and the wide, unbridgeable distance between them. Still, she stepped back and opened the door wider. He entered cautiously, his eyes darting around the small space, taking in the simple furniture, the neatness, the life she had built without him. He set the bag awkwardly on the kitchen counter and turned to face her, his hands empty, his expression uncertain. I didn't know where else to go," he said, almost a whisper. Grace gestured to the table where her half-folded laundry lay. She moved back to her seat, picked up the sweater she had left, and resumed folding, calm and deliberate. She didn't ask him to sit, but he pulled out a chair and lowered himself into it, his movements slow and uncertain. For a while, they sat like that, the only sound the soft snap of fabric as Grace smoothed and folded. "I found out," Tyler said finally, his voice breaking the stillness, "about the donations, about everything." Grace did not look up. She folded another towel, smoothing its edges with the flat of her palm. "I didn't understand at first," he continued, "how you could just go, how you could do all that and not tell me." Grace placed the towel neatly on the growing stack beside her and met his eyes for the first time. "You didn't notice when I stayed," she said simply. "Why would you notice when I left?" Tyler flinched as if struck. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. "I thought I was helping," he said after a moment, his voice desperate, pleading. "I thought you needed to be taken care of." Grace tilted her head slightly, regarding him. "You thought I needed to be managed," she corrected softly. "Handled, put away somewhere convenient." He shook his head, but the protest died on his lips. In the silence that stretched between them, the truth hung heavy and undeniable. "I was scared," he said finally, the words dragging themselves out of him. "Scared you'd get hurt, that I'd lose you." Grace smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips. "You lost me long before Rose Pines." Tyler dropped his gaze to the table, tracing the wood grain with a fingertip. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I know," Grace said, and she did. She believed him. He hadn't set out to abandon her, to make her feel small and invisible. He had simply allowed the inertia of his own life to pull him away, little by little, until she was no longer a person but a problem to solve, a burden to shift onto more manageable shoulders. Love, she had learned, could fade not through cruelty, but through neglect. "I just wanted to come," he said, lifting his eyes to hers again, "to say I'm sorry." Grace looked at him for a long moment, feeling the truth of the years between them settle into place. She saw the apology for what it was, sincere perhaps, but too late to undo the choices that had brought them here. "I forgive you," she said, her voice steady and clear, "but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean going back." He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her words. "I understand." Grace rose from her chair, gathering the folded laundry into her arms. She moved to the small linen closet by the hall, placing each item neatly inside. When she returned, Tyler was still sitting there, looking lost in a way she had never seen before. "I don't expect anything," he said quietly. I wanted you to know. I see it now. What I did. What I didn't do." Grace walked to the sink and poured herself a glass of water. She sipped it slowly, giving herself time to think. "You're welcome to find your own peace, Tyler," she said at last, "but you'll have to find it without me." He stood then, slowly, awkwardly, the crumpled bag still untouched on the counter. "I brought you lemon scones," he said, as if the gesture could bridge the gulf between them. Grace nodded once, not unkindly. "Thank you." He hovered for a moment, as if waiting for some invitation, some permission that would not come. Finally, he turned and walked to the door. He paused there, his hand on the knob, and looked back at her. "I'll always love you, Mom," he said. Grace met his gaze, calm and unflinching. "And I will always wish you well," she replied. He opened the door and stepped out into the sunlight, the screen door swinging shut behind him with a soft sigh. Grace stood for a long time, staring at the closed door, feeling the echoes of his presence fade from the room. Then she turned back to the counter, picked up the bag of scones, and placed it carefully in the bread box. She wasn't ready to eat them now. Maybe she never would. But she didn't need to decide that today. Today, she'd done something harder than forgiven. She had let go. Outside, the sea continued its endless dance against the shore, indifferent and eternal. The rosemary in her garden swayed in the breeze, their fragrant green sprigs reaching toward the sky. Grace sat down at her kitchen table once more, folded her hands in her lap, and breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the clean, salt-tanged air of her new life. For the first time in a long, long time, she felt free. Not because someone had granted her permission, but because she had claimed it herself. The days after Tyler's visit unfolded like the slow unfurling of a sail, steady and certain, each one carrying Grace further into the life she had built for herself. There was no sudden rush of triumph, no jubilant celebration, only a quiet, growing sense of rightness, as natural and inevitable as the tide that kissed the shore beyond her garden. She did not think often about their meeting. When she did, it was without bitterness. She replayed no arguments, rehearsed no words left unsaid. The past, once so heavy and entangling, now lay gently behind her, like a stone worn smooth by years of current and storm. She had released Tyler from the expectations that had once bound her so tightly to disappointment. She had released herself from the endless ache of waiting for what would never come. Now, her life stretched before her, wide and sunlit and hers alone. Grace settled deeper into the rhythms of her new existence. She woke early, not because someone rang a bell or demanded her presence, but because she wanted to. She brewed her coffee slowly, savoring the rich aroma as it filled the kitchen. She stood on her porch in the mornings, barefoot sometimes, feeling the damp wood under her feet, watching the fog roll in from the bay and lift like a curtain rising on a familiar, beloved stage. She found joy in the smallest things: a bird building a nest in the eaves, a new blossom unfolding in the garden, the warm roughness of a seashell she picked up during her long, slow walks along the beach. Every detail, every moment, was a reminder that she had chosen this life and that no one could take it from her. The neighbors had begun to know her in the way that small towns absorb newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and easy acceptance. They called her Miss Grace, smiled and waved when they passed her at the market or the post office. They did not ask intrusive questions about her past, did not demand explanations for the life she had built alone. They knew her simply as a kind woman with a calm voice and an easy laugh, someone who always had a book tucked under her arm and a soft spot for lost animals. She joined a book club at the library, a small group of women and a few men who gathered once a week to discuss novels and share stories over coffee and homemade cookies. Grace listened more than she spoke at first, content to absorb the cadences of new friendships forming around her like a warm quilt. But, over time, she found herself contributing more, offering insights, laughing along with the others, letting herself be seen without fear. One afternoon after book club, two women her age, Marjorie and Lillian, invited her to an impromptu ice cream outing. They piled into Marjorie's battered old sedan, laughing like schoolgirls, and spent the afternoon sitting on a bench overlooking the water, sticky cones melting in the sunshine. Someone found a photo booth tucked into the corner of the little shopping square, and on a whim, they crammed inside, faces pressed together, giggling as the camera flashed. Grace pinned the strip of black and white photos to her refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a lighthouse. She looked at it often, marveling at the way her own smile looked so effortless, so real. Her foundation, the voice's forgotten trust, continued to grow in quiet, powerful ways. She worked closely with her attorney and a small, hand-picked advisory board to direct the funds carefully and thoughtfully. They funded reading programs at senior centers, legal aid for elderly individuals fighting for their independence, scholarships for social work students committed to elder advocacy. Every time a letter arrived thanking her, or more often, thanking the anonymous donor, Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest, deep and sustaining. She had found a way to turn her sorrow into something that mattered. She had turned the ache of abandonment into a bridge for others to find their way home. Sometimes, sitting by the window, as the late afternoon light slanted golden through the glass, she thought about the girl who had handed her that lottery ticket in the grocery store. A small, unthinking kindness that had unraveled the very fabric of Grace's life and rewoven it into something stronger, more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. Grace wrote a letter to the grocery store once, addressed simply to the management, thanking them for employing a young woman who had, without knowing it, saved a life. She never received a reply, but she didn't need one. Some gifts were meant to pass through the world quietly, changing it without demanding acknowledgement. Tyler did not come back. He did not call. He sent a single letter, months after their meeting. A short, halting apology filled with more regret than hope. Grace read it once, folded it carefully, and tucked it into a drawer alongside the other remnants of a life she had lived with open hands and an open heart. She did not hate him. She did not love him in the same way she once had either. What she felt was something softer, sadder, and infinitely freer. She wished him peace, truly. She hoped he found it, but she no longer felt responsible for carrying him to it. Her life was not a monument to the pain she had endured. It was a testament to the choices she had made after the pain had passed through her. One morning, Grace sat at the kitchen table, a soft breeze stirring the curtains, and sorted through a small wooden box she kept on the shelf above the fireplace. Inside were her few treasures: the tarnished quarter Tyler had once pressed into her hand, the winning lottery ticket, now faded and fragile, and the photo strip from the ice cream outing. She held the ticket between her fingers for a long time, remembering the night she had scratched it, alone in the sterile stillness of Rose Pines. It had not been the ticket that saved her, she realized now. It had simply reminded her of what she had almost forgotten, that life, even at its bleakest, still held the possibility of change. She placed the ticket back in the box with reverence, not as a talisman, but as a reminder that she had saved herself. In town, the seasons turned slowly. Summer crept in with its lazy, humming afternoons. Children ran barefoot down the sidewalks, dragging kites and chasing each other through sprinklers. Tourists wandered the boardwalks buying saltwater taffy and taking pictures of the sunsets. Grace moved through it all with a quiet joy, a participant rather than an observer. She learned to bake better bread, taught a few local teenagers how to plant herb gardens, started reading poetry aloud at the library's open mic nights. Her life was not grand, not spectacular. It was steady and rich and real. One evening, as the sky turned the color of old roses and the sea shimmered beneath the first stars, Grace stood on her porch, a shawl draped over her shoulders, and watched the world breathe. A young couple walked by, their toddler stumbling between them, clutching a bright red ball. The child laughed, a high, pure sound that carried on the wind. Grace smiled and lifted her hand in a small wave. The couple waved back, warm and easy, before continuing down the path toward the beach. She stood there for a long time, the coolness of the evening seeping into her bones, not with ache, but with comfort. Her life was not perfect. She had scars, visible and invisible. There were days when the loneliness pressed closer, when she missed the sound of a familiar voice, the feel of a hand reaching for hers. But she was not broken. She was not waiting. She was living. And that, she thought, as she watched the tide roll out under a rising moon, was the truest kind of peace she had ever known. Inside her house, the small wooden box sat on its shelf, quiet and patient, holding the artifacts of a journey not marked by wealth or notoriety, but by resilience. Grace walked back inside, closed the door gently against the night, and turned off the lights one by one until only the soft glow of the porch lamp remained, a beacon against the darkness. She climbed into bed, pulled the quilt up to her chin, and listened to the rhythm of the waves until sleep claimed her. She dreamed not of what she had lost, but of what she had found, a life of her own making, a home built not of obligation or longing, but of simple, hard-won joy. And when the dawn came, painting the world in colors too beautiful to describe, Grace Williams woke smiling, ready for another day she had chosen, another day she had reclaimed, another day truly, finally hers. Adieu. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out other videos on the channel. There's always something worth watching. And if you know someone who would appreciate this, feel free to share it with them.